Welcome to this edition of the Talk of Simsbury. My name is Dominique Avery. My guest today is Pastor George Harris. He's been the senior minister at Simsbury's First Church of Christ for just over a year. If you are not a member of his church, you may not have any idea who he is. Why have I invited him today? Is he the Talk of Simsbury? I don't think so, but perhaps he should be. Just listen to his remarks at the 7th annual Martin Luther King Jr. observance at his church a few weeks ago.
Those who have attended this service before have no doubt heard the story that here at First Church in 1947, 70 years ago, the summer organist Garland Martin heard a beautiful male singing voice rising from the congregation. Upon further inquiry, he learned that the man singing was one of a group of young black summer tobacco workers earning money for their education at Morehouse College in Georgia. Mr. Martin invited that young man to join the summer choir and subsequently entertained him at his home for dinner. Of course, that young man was Martin Luther King Jr. And of course, we love to tell that story here at First Church. It makes us feel good about ourselves, proud even. But it occurs to me that there is an important question that must be coupled with that story every time it is told. And that question is, what story will be told about us 70 years from now? And will that story make the teller proud?
Pastor George first came to my attention last year when he'd been at his new job for just 2 weeks. That's when I heard him speak at both the state MLK observance and the town's. I was intrigued, and I've been wanting to interview him ever since. Welcome, Pastor George. I'm so glad I finally got the chance to get you here.
Thank you, Dominique.
So, you couldn't hear it, but because of our technology limitations, but the piece of your speech that our viewers heard was how we in Simsbury love to tell the story of Martin Luther King here, what it meant to him, and how it makes us proud. But then you went on to say that the story also raises a question. What story will be told about us in the future? What did you mean by that?
Well, first, let me again affirm that story about Martin Luther King Jr. It's extraordinary and should be told and retold, and we should tell it with great enthusiasm. And I think it begs a question. Are we telling it just to make ourselves feel good? Because frankly, it was 70 years ago, and most of us were not a part of that particular experience. Or are we telling it to inspire our own life and our own action? And of course, I believe that we tell it mostly for the latter reason, to inspire us today, and that then raises the question, how will we be looked upon in 70 years, and what kind of stories will they be telling about us?
So what kind of stories will people be telling about the parishioners at First Church?
Wow, that's a great question. So I've been there just over a year, as you said, and I couldn't be happier and frankly more proud to be leading that good church. I would say that the thing that has struck me most about the parishioners there is just how actively they are involved in the community. I just couldn't even begin to list all the things they do and the ways they participate, but a very high level of volunteerism. In fact, I'm quite sure that people will be telling stories about those folks for generations, really.
So one of the things that you have spoken and written about is, and I think that you want to talk about today, are your thoughts on the church's role in this challenging political climate.
Indeed. and thank you for asking. It is a challenging political climate, and even beyond that, I think it's just so very challenging for many, many people personally. We are so divided about so many things, and I don't need to say much about that. Families are divided across the dinner table. People are extraordinarily divided over social media, and it's a very, very trying time. Some might reasonably say that the church's function in such times is to bring people together. That's fair to say. This is biblical. Paul wrote about slave and free, and men and women and Greeks and Jews all coming together. So reconciliation is a very, very powerful aspect of our faith. That said, we also, as people of faith, and as Christians in particular, stand for something. We commit to follow in the ways of Jesus. And Jesus said and did things that had particular emphasis and stood alongside particular people. And so in short, there's a tension, I believe, in the role of churches and in the role of pastors today, because there is a legitimate reconciling function. And there is also this need to speak to what we, as best as we can understand it, believe is true. And that is not always a truth that everyone wants to hear. So there's an inherent tension sometimes in those two functions.
So I read something that you wrote about a sermon that you gave after our recent election and the reaction of some of your parishioners. That must have tested both you and your parishioners, both those who were enthusiastic about the election results and those who were frankly horrified.
That is true. And that's the place that I'm speaking from as I share these things with you today. I did preach a sermon on the Sunday after the election, and I named some things that had been said in the course of the election, and I challenged those things. And I suggested as much as to say those things that were said and some of the things that were done were not consistent with the teachings and the life of Jesus. I would say that it's fair to say that I had some energy behind that sermon. I preached it with a certain amount of emotion, and when I was done, and this has never happened before, certainly in my short tenure at First Church, but a significant number of people in the congregation applauded. Now, on the one hand, that might have felt affirming to me, though I really don't think it was because it was such a great sermon. It was because there were a number of people in the congregation that felt heard, that they were saying, yes, that's what I believe too. Just as much, I also recognized immediately what effect that would have on those who didn't resonate with my words, and that my words themselves might have been challenging enough to some, but then to have people applaud would have made others feel even more left out. And so this is the challenge. How do I speak the truth of the Gospels as best as I understand it, while also genuinely listening to, caring for, bringing in those who might have other views? And it's a significant challenge, I would suggest, for most ministers.
So it's been a difficult time. This has been sort of this whole thing has played out in this first year that you were in Simsbury, right?
Well, that is true. And I would say I don't shy away from that. I feel like these things are the very essence of what it means to be a minister. And I have never felt my call to this work so strongly as I have in these recent months.
So maybe this is a good time to ask you to share with us a little bit about how you got into the ministry. I've read that you described yourself as a Christmas and Easter Christian at first. So how did you get from somebody who goes to church at Christmas and Easter to being a minister?
Well, it's an interesting story, and it's probably too long for the brief amount of time we have. So I'll start. I was raised what is known as a Christmas and Easter Christian, with my mother and father bringing us to church just on those two holy days. And not surprisingly then, after I graduated high school, I didn't really have much to do with church, because why would I, right? I'd only had that limited exposure as a kid. I found my way back to church as an adult in my mid-20s, just wanting to find a little more meaning in my life. And so I found my own way back to church. No thoughts of ministry at all, mostly just looking for a supportive community and some guidance and meaning in my life. I also left 7 years in the Navy as an officer in the Navy and began work in nonprofits doing health and human service work. So I worked with street youth, I worked with people living with AIDS, I led a homeless ministry, and that's what brought me into the ministry. Is I ended up working for a church, leading them in a homeless ministry, and it was there among those people that I served that I experienced a very strong call. Really, I sometimes say everything I was doing fit like a glove, and I realized this is who I am, and this is what I'm meant to do. So that was 1998, I guess. So I've been doing this for almost 20 years in some form.
So no, I'm interested in, so you had this experience, you could have felt a political call. You could have gone on to be a community organizer. And so, but you chose this way. I mean, did you have a sort of a vision? What happened? What brought you there? What was the difference? I'm not a religious person, so I'm really curious about what happens there.
That's an interesting question as well. So those elements are there, as we were talking. There's some political elements, there's some community organizing elements in ministry that are inherent to ministry. I'd say that what drew me in particular to work within churches, one, I just love people. I love the one-on-one connection. I love sharing life and faith with people. I love accompanying them in their journey through faith and through life. And those other things you described, political or community organizing, I think are a degree removed or two from that real kind of close human contact. And the other thing I'm passionate about is community and what happens in a congregation when people come together in faith. Part of it is that reconciling function that I spoke to, is to see how people who are quite different in many ways can come together and build a bond together.
So in the beginning, we talked a little bit about, you talked a little bit about how will we in Simsbury be judged in 70 years by what we do. Do you feel like the community of Simsbury, we live in this, somebody I read online once described your church, somebody who was sort of visiting from out of town, he described your church as posh. I was it was online somewhere. I think you could still find it. If you put your church in posh, it will come up. It was a review long before you came. So I don't think of our community as posh. I think of our community as a very safe place. There's almost no crime. It's well done. People are doing well. Do you think, are we doing enough in Simsbury? Are we thinking about the world enough? Are we, for instance, in Simsbury, has there been an effort to, even right now as we speak, Donald Trump is talking about limiting the number of Syrians who can come. I personally, as the child of an immigrant who might have died not having come here, I feel like I don't feel like we're doing enough to welcome people like that. Are we? Should we be doing more?
So my first response is not a quantitative one. It's not saying more or how much. My first response is to affirm a bit of what you said. I wouldn't affirm the posh comment.
Right. I also thought that was outrageous.
But I have also heard people say, the Simsbury bubble. And I think there is a certain truth to that. I have heard that same statement said both in an affirming way, how lucky we are to live in the Simsbury bubble. And I've also heard it said in a critical way. Oh, people in Simsbury, they live in a bubble. So isn't that interesting? I think there's a certain truth to that.
Right.
I think there is a way that if we chose to, we could lead rather isolated lives here and insulate ourselves from a lot of what's going on in the world. That said, and some no doubt take advantage of that Simsbury bubble and do just that. That said, I'm very, very struck in my year here just how much people are doing. You mentioned the refugee situation. There is a very, very energized group of people, not just at First Church, but First Church, a couple other churches, a community group from West Hartford that have come together, some 40 or 50 people that are very, very energized about sponsoring a refugee family right now. And so that's been my most significant experience, is to see the energy and the desire to do more. I think many people don't know how, and that's one of the functions of the church, is to create opportunities and open up opportunities for people. But those experiences far outweigh for me the experiences of people saying, oh no, I'd really rather not.
So what else could we be doing? I mean, you're saying people don't know what to do.
Well, one doesn't have to look very far. I know there's both civic opportunities, and if church isn't one's preferred way of getting involved, there's many, many things to do right here in town. There's many more in Hartford. There's wonderful organizations like Hands on Hartford and Journey Home and many of these others that the church supports that are always looking for volunteers. Food Share. There's a Food Share truck that comes right to the First Church parking lot on a regular basis and gives out food, and volunteers are part of that effort. So there's always opportunities. I know that there's a social service office right here in Eno Hall, and that's a place one could look, and go to your local church. First Church could make those kind of connections. I know that the Methodist Church down the street could as well. There's many, many good folks doing good work here.
So when I don't think I've interviewed a minister before, so I'm curious as to how you determine what you're going to talk about in a sermon every Sunday.
Well, I would say that, the correct answer for any minister is that we begin with the Bible, right? Because that would only be proper. But someone once said you preach with the Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other. And I'd say even more than a newspaper, it's just the people's lives that you're in relationship with. As a pastor, you know what is going on with your folks, you know what's happening in the life of the church, and there's almost always a connection to be made between what we read in the Bible and the lives that I have been entrusted with.
So when you came to Simsbury, so what drew you here? I think I read, and we talked a little bit before we went on the air, that you actually lived in Connecticut in your early life.
Well, I did, but it's really coincidental that I have that connection. It wasn't part of what brought me here. For 8 years before coming to Simsbury, I served a church in downtown New Britain. And so I heard some of those posh and bubble comments from the hard-hitting New Britain folks as I was preparing to come. And
they feel like you sold out?
You would have to ask them, perhaps. But I really don't feel that way. I find that the work here is very, very rich and meaningful. That said, I have worked in urban settings and what might be described as on the margins for some 25 years. And so this is a shift in focus for me. And quite frankly, it all began with one person that I knew at my last church, who, because of the woman he married, moved to First Church, and he began putting something in my ear saying, you should really look at this and think about this. And no, that's not me at all. And one of the things that we are told, I say we ministers, but also people of faith, is pay attention. Listen for what God might be saying to you. And he said it enough times, this friend of mine, that I decided I better not just close this off. I better pay attention, because maybe God is moving in this in some way. And so there's a big thing that you fill out, and I filled it out, and then there's conversations to be had, and each time I just kept taking another step, and somewhere along the way, something moved in me and made me go, you know what?
Now, was it an unusual choice for the parishioners of First Church? Were you an unusual choice?
You'd have to ask them. Having been here a year, it now seems, for me, it seems obvious. And I would like to think that some there at First Church would say something similar. It just seems like a very, very good fit. I bring all of that past 25 years experience with me. It's part of who I am. I just wrote my newsletter column that's yesterday about a homeless man that I knew in the beach park, and I told his story. So all of that's part of me. And yet, so this is the thing. This is really what the connection. First Church Simsbury is me. I've been ministering in all these other settings for many, many years, but I am a Caucasian, well-educated, middle-class person. And so doesn't it make sense that at this time in my life, I minister to folks like me?
Well, it actually does make sense. So I mentioned in the very beginning that I immediately noticed you when you went to Hartford to speak at the Martin Luther King observance there. And I don't think any pastor from Simsbury had ever been there before. How did that come about? Did you volunteer? Did somebody reach out to you? Or
I can't claim any that was nothing about me. I can only assume, as you said, I'd only been here 2 weeks. I can only assume that somebody had passed along this story about the connection here to Martin Luther King, and that somebody had been intrigued by that. And I think they just picked up the phone and called First Church, and there I was.
No, I think maybe somebody had been asked before and said no.
No, I can't imagine. That just seems
Yeah,
ridiculous.
well, I mean, it has been. I mean, it's not that long that everybody knows about it, but it's been multiple years. So I was quite struck by that, and I think the press was quite struck by it, because they said, this pastor from Simsbury came and admonished people to think about the present and the issues that have not been resolved completely.
Well, I will say that in the circles I travel in among clergy in the greater Hartford area, there's a community organizing initiative going on in the greater Hartford area, a faith-based community organizing initiative. This question of how do we come to identify ourselves more fully as greater Hartford instead of just the city and the suburbs comes up a lot. Right. And not just in faith settings.
So it's coming up politically now.
Coming up politically as well, but I think that's a very powerful question and an important one. And so being able to go to the Capitol last year and offer a prayer at the Martin Luther King observance there, I thought was a very effective way of making that statement.
So too. Certainly caught my attention.
Yeah.
You wrote not too long ago about your installation service and about remarks that the Reverend McAllister made, and I'm assuming that's a woman?
That is indeed.
She said that God was stirring up the waters at First Church and encouraged the First Church community to wade in the water together. And then you wrote, we all laughed in recognition when she suggested that we're more comfortable sitting in our beach chair right now at the water's edge, just sticking our toe in the water. So talk about that image a little bit. I thought that was a great image, especially for Simsbury.
Absolutely. Well, Reverend Dave McAllister, who you mentioned, is a brilliant speaker, very engaging, very draws people in, and she did it in this case with her warmth and her humor and her image of wading in the water. It's an African-American spiritual, that song, Wade in the Water, and so, so that was what she was drawing from. And looking back, because that was when, in June, I think, my installation, I don't remember exactly. It was some months ago when she preached that sermon. The election hadn't gotten very far, and certainly the results couldn't have been anticipated or imagined. And so she was just saying this in general. Come on, Simsbury, I challenge you to follow your pastor into more uncomfortable places. And now looking back, it was extraordinarily prophetic, because that's exactly what has come to pass, and it provided me an image to kind of bring back to people and say, remember, we all laughed, we all said, yes, that's what we want to do. They didn't just laugh, the church didn't just laugh, yes, that's what we want a leader that can lead us into the water. And well, this is what it looks like, this is what it feels like, and let's not forget.
Okay, so we just have a couple minutes left. I have been asking the questions. You have generously come and given me your time. Is there something that I haven't asked you about, a point that you would like to make?
The only thing I would say is that regardless of how one voted, regardless of whether one is feeling hopeful or filled with fear and dread right now, I don't think there's ever been a more important time for people to engage and participate and be a part of what's going on. I concluded that sermon I preached on the Sunday after the election by saying, it doesn't matter how you voted. I used the parable of the Good Samaritan who helped the man alongside the road. And I said, we are all called to walk on that side of the road and to help and care for the most vulnerable people in our society. And it's not a partisan thing, it's not a political thing, but we're all called to walk on that side of the road. And that's what I would affirm.
Thank you, Pastor George. Our time is up.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much for coming, and I'm going to urge you to think about doing your own show here, or having your parishioners tape your sermons. Let me just thank everybody else here at SCTV, Karen Hanville, the director, and Kristen Benedict for her editing and getting the show on the air. Thanks especially to my guest, Pastor George Harris. And finally, thank you for joining us. If you missed any portion of the show, you can always find it on our website at simsburytv.org. I'm Dominique Avery. See you next time for the Talk of Simsbury.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.